This video is brought to you by Manta Sleep. The Alien franchise has probably been one of the hardest fought production cycles in cinema history, with each successive film having story after story about the crazy struggles, not even just to finish filming the movies, but just to get them off the ground in the first place. The result, though, has left us with classics that have beat the test of time. It's also had career-defining moments for young directors, and of course a certain actress. Other films, though, maybe could have used a bit more time in pre-production, but still there are future entries that are coming that can bring in another generation to the dark world of the Alien universe.
What do you mean there's something in the water?
There's just something in the fucking water.
With all this history in mind, join us on our 7-part series of the production of the first Alien film in 1979 all the way to Alien Romulus of 2024. This is the production of Alien. Alien began as the brainchild of writer and producer Dan Obannon, starting with a film Obannon produced as a student project at Southern California University called Dark Star.
It is the future. Mankind has conquered the stars. He moves out to the endless interstellar reaches of the universe.
Obannon produced Dark Star together with fellow student John Carpenter as a sci-fi parody, where a bumbling crew has to navigate a malfunctioning ship after years of mundane work, as well as an alien creature they've adopted as a mascot, which starts misbehaving. Let's just say it doesn't go well for them.
You can't explode in the bomb bay, because it's foolish. You'll kill us all. There's no reason for it.
I am programmed to detonate in 9 minutes.
Obannon then had the idea to remake Dark Star as a horror rather than a comedy, a concept he called the germ of Alien. The central point of a crew on a mundane mission disrupted by malfunctions and an alien being were preserved.
I had this opening. I didn't know where it was going to go. I had this creepy opening in which astronauts awaken to find that their voyage home has been interrupted. They're receiving a signal from this mysterious planetoid in an alien language. They go down to investigate.
Although in early drafts of the script, which was called Memory at the time, Obannon didn't have a clear idea who the antagonist would be. It's hard to imagine this now, since the Xenomorph is what most people think of when they think of the Alien films. But in Dark Star, the alien was a weird beach ball-shaped creature that was killed off halfway into the plot. The Xenomorph really came about because of another project. Obannon was hired to work on a movie adaptation of Dune by director Alejandro Jodorowsky.
For me, Dune will be the coming of a god, artistical, cinematographical god.
Where he met a crew of artists including Chris Foss, Jean Girard, also known as Mobius, and crucially, H.R. Giger.
He had seen this guy's work in his show that was in Paris at the time. Took me over to one of the really fancy hotels in Paris. Not the one I was staying in. Where this artist named Ridley was staying while his show was on display in Paris. Giger brings out this little tinfoil. He said, "Would you like some opium?" I said, "Why do you take that?" He said, "I am afraid of my visions." He said, "It's only your mind." He said, "That is what I'm afraid of."
Obannon found himself being horrified and mesmerized by Giger's work, which he described by saying, "I have never seen anything so horrible and yet quite so beautiful in my life." And so when Jodorowsky's Dune was canceled after he failed to receive financial backing for his ambitious and somewhat insane plans, Obannon turned back to the Memory Project, with a central antagonist now in mind, a Giger-like monster. after the collapse of the Dune film left Obannon homeless, ending up on the sofa of fellow screenwriter Ronnie Shusett in LA. Desperate for something that would win over the studios and get him back on the saddle, it was from here that the two of them penned this new version of the script. It first got a title change as The Star Beast, before eventually setting on a simpler, more memorable name.
One morning at 3 o'clock, Ronnie's apartment, I'm typing away, writing dialogue, and the characters are saying the alien this and the alien that. And suddenly, that word alien just came up out of the typewriter at me. I said, alien. It's a noun and it's an adjective. They said, yes, that's it. I have the title.
It's simple. It's one word, and no one's ever used it.
With most of the story in place, Obannon and Shusett went off to present the script to several studios, famously pitching it as Jaws in space. After several failed deals with the film nearly ended up with the indie producer Roger Corman, who was about to sign with Obannon and Shusett to produce the film as a budget project. At the last minute, a friend of the two offered to find them a better deal. That friend passed the script on to a trio of producers, which we will talk about a lot in this series: Walter Hill, David Giler, and Gordon Carroll, owners of a brand new company called Brandywine. They all thought that the script was mostly poor quality, but were struck by the Chestburster scene and decided to greenlight the script, seeing its potential. Giler and Hill ended up wanting to more than produce the film. They also wanted to rewrite it, putting the script through numerous redrafts, which Obannon and Shusett heavily criticized, with Shusett arguing that the redrafts were making the film worse due to Giler's and Hill's lack of interest or enthusiasm for science fiction. One day, Obannon walked into their office and noticed something peculiar on the desk.
I remember walking into Gordon Carroll's office and seeing a script on the desk and lifting up the page, and it said Alien by Walter Hill. Gordon walks in. I said, Gordon, what's this? Gordon looked very embarrassed. He said, oh, you're not supposed to see that.
Inevitably, Obannon suggested that the two were trying to get the writing credits for the film. The characters were renamed, dialogue rewritten, and a new character, the cyborg Ash, had been added.
But they contributed one thing, which is one of the best things in the movie. What they invented was the robot. That was not in the movie, where the robot's Ash is a robot and his head comes off. That whole idea and scenario was theirs.
This reworked script was the one ultimately submitted to 20th Century Fox, although ironically, Obannon ended up with the sole credit for the screenplay despite this, thanks to a decision from the Writers Guild Union. As Fox was considering the project, Obannon provided some post-production help on Star Wars, leaving him with enough money to finally get off of Shusett's couch and move into an apartment. Star Wars actually turned out to be what made the difference in getting Alien off the ground. Fox wasn't interested in the project at first, but after the Star Wars success, they were desperate to put out another space film, and Alien was the only one they had in process. With Obannon recalling that, they wanted to follow through on Star Wars, and they wanted to follow through fast, and the only spaceship script they had sitting on their desk was Alien.
Our ship has now entered the interstellar travel zone. Approximately 5 years and 7 months remain on our journey. Please make your way to your specified cryo chamber for immediate downturn. Once you arrive, please put on the mask provided by our sponsor for this interstellar journey, Mantis Sleep. These sleep masks provide true 100% blackout for deeper sleep, which means no more waking up to the flickering fluorescent lights on the spaceship 3 years before you're supposed to. These masks are completely adjustable to your specific measurements. The premium material with C-shaped eye cups for side sleeping will keep you cool and comfortable with the perforated foam.
As someone who constantly travels, if you're looking for a lightweight, comfortable, and premium sleeper mask, Manta Sleep is the right mask for you.
Now before you go into cryo sleep, pull out your tablets and check out Mantis Sleep here, or click the link in the description. And make sure to use the code Voyager for 10% off your order.
Morning, Mother.
And so Fox greenlit the project with an initial budget of $4.5 million. Originally, Obannon thought he would be the director, with Walter Hill also being suggested. But Fox wanted movie names, and so the film was passed around between several of them, going from Robert Aldrich to Peter Yates to Jack Clayton, John Borman, and Robert Altman being other names floated around. But everyone either rejected it or was rejected, some because they didn't seem to be able to handle the special effects the film would demand, others because they simply didn't like the premise, and some wrote the idea off as a B-movie. As Shusett put it, they lacked vision for what Alien could be.
I had done The Duelists and got a prize at Cannes, and I think by being fifth choice, I think they were definitely scraping the bottom of the barrel. And they sent me this script, because I remember by the reaction when I said, I love the script, you do?
After some of the top brass of Brandywine saw Ridley Scott's film The Duelist, they were impressed by how his driving vision brought the film to life and decided to put him forward as their new directorial candidate. This left Obannon confused, given that Scott had no sci-fi experience. But the directorial choice wasn't being looked at from a genre angle, but from a talent angle, which he conceded they may have had a point with. Scott himself was aware of his own shortcomings, though, saying, "In the beginning, I didn't quite know what I was going to be getting myself in for, because I'd never gotten involved with effects before. I'd never really been a science fiction fanatic. Although I felt that at some point, I would like to have a shot at such a subject." Despite not having much experience in effects work, he took on the project and made it a point to fight for it, spending 3.5 weeks storyboarding the film to present his vision to Fox.
And I storyboarded the movie, and then I took it back with me. It's this thick and like this. The budget was $4.2 million. I went back and we doubled the budget. We went straight to 8.6. It just shows the power of a little bit of pen on paper, because they went, wow, because they had no idea what could be done.
When it came to casting, things were rather open-ended, as Shusett had written all the characters as unisex, so you could seamlessly interchange any character with a male or female actor. This was even outright specified in drafts of the script, but he did admit that the idea of making the lead a woman had never occurred to him before. It was apparently the president of Fox, Alan Ladd, who suggested that the protagonist, Ripley, should be a woman, suggesting it would make the film more unique. Ripley was in fact the last character to be cast, with many names being floated around including Catherine Ross, Genevieve Bujold, Veronica Cartwright, Helen Mirren, and Meryl Streep. Sigourney Weaver had never acted in film before, having been recommended from Broadway, but the way she managed to sell herself as Ripley was actually an accident.
I actually went to the wrong place, and I called my agent and I said, oh, you know, it was like Friday afternoon. I said, I don't know, the script was, she said, just go.
She had ended up going to the wrong hotel for her audition by mistake. After finding the right place around a half an hour later, she sprinted to the hotel room and tried to compose herself.
We hear fast-paced feet coming toward the door and then slowing down and composing itself, and the bell rings and Mary opens the door, and Ripley was standing there. This extraordinary-looking woman, tall, commanding presence.
It was this mix of trying to maintain composure and confidence while having an obvious layer of fear behind it that seemed just like Ripley was supposed to be.
Wait a minute. If we let it in, the ship could be infected. You know the quarantine procedure.
24 hours for decontamination.
It ultimately came down to two, Meryl Streep and Weaver would win out, while Veronica Cartwright was cast as the other female crew member, Lambert. Production would begin on October 21st, 1978, in Pinewood Studios and Shepperton Studios near London. With the script finished and the narrative having been extensively storyboarded, it was time for the team to pull up their sleeves and get to work.
I seem to remember the length of the production was, I think it must have been about 14 weeks. I know we went over a couple. It was a tough schedule, very, very tough. It was tough because Ridley was, as always, pushes the fabric.
Within the first 4 days of shooting, there were 9 producers and studio executives on the set, just counting the minutes on Ridley and complaining and why wasn't he shooting, and he was shooting so fast. They gave him no pre-light time, so he was trying to find the look in the first 2 days. And it did get to Ridley. I remember one instant, I was right next to him He went off like a rocket. It was like power coming out. He punched his fist right through the ceiling of the bridge in just sheer frustration because he did not understand why everyone was on his back.
For this feature, the crew needed to account for an arrangement of props, set work, and organizational challenges. One of the main attributes of Alien sets was that the spaceship it was going to be predominantly set in was one continuous piece instead of separated assortments of rooms.
So you could actually walk around the set and come out in different places and never leave it. And that's in a way how Ridley liked it and shot it.
Alien was very much a practical film, and the holistic design of the Nostromo very much aided its production and claustrophobic vibe that other solutions would likely have trouble replicating. However, the Nostromo interior by far isn't the only set used on Alien. We got a variety of environments from deep shafts to extraterrestrial vistas. The only constraint, as per usual, was money.
And Peter Beale would go around knowing exactly what Ridley was like. He'd discovered over the weeks of shooting. He would actually do sort of like a march around the studio and look at all the stages to make sure that all the sets that were being built, there was nothing that was being built without his approval. And I seem to remember it was this tussle of him saying, that is not going to be built, we're cancelling that set. And Ridley saying, no, build it, build it.
There were various inspirations for Alien, and one of them was 2001: A Space Odyssey, go figure, which is what inspired the design of the Nostromo to a certain extent.
Ridley was pushing the envelope. I mean, designing sets that had one hadn't seen sets like that sort of at that time since Kubrick and 2001. I mean, absolutely incredible.
However, Scott wanted less overhead lighting and a more naturalistic type of lighting environment. What made this goal difficult to achieve at first was the mix of light bulbs on set and the generally dark nature of Alien scenes. Tungsten, fluorescent, and incandescent light bulbs, which were clashing together and made it very difficult to shoot a good-looking scene. So in the end, they opted to just build the lights as they needed them, which they initially wanted to avoid. This brings in the cinematographer for Alien, Derek Van Lint, who was someone that previously worked only on advertisements on TV and other small gigs. But his method of lighting, or in general preparation, was a pretty quick, matter-of-fact approach. Essentially, instead of being extremely technical and thinking through everything more than once, he goes on set, observes what works, and then shoots. Another issue was that all the sets were four-wallers and had ceilings, meaning that there was just very little space to set up lights that could brighten up the scene. The limitation, however, aided the visuals of the movie, with much of the lighting being achieved in creative ways, like setting up lights behind grates, hiding a lamp in the scene, or having a light source in the shot that also exists in the world.
Quite difficult to light in places, so unless you were going to swamp something with front light, then it was a bit complex, especially as so much of the movie was shot handheld with Ridley, although he did some form of blocking. It didn't mean to say it was particularly where he was going to end up.
What makes the lighting of Alien so interesting too is that there were 3 different lighting modes. The Nostromo before the crew wakes up being much darker as the space isn't being used by the crew. Then the Nostromo under working lights, which means that the working area is lit up in a practical manner, facilitating work for the people on board. And finally, those light sources needed to be progressively destroyed and replaced by emergency lights as the chaos on the ship was escalating. While the production was fleshing itself out into an ever more special film, it just wouldn't be quite the hit it is today without the influence of a certain disturbed artist.
He was very strange looking, dressed all in black, this Swiss accent. And when we were looking at his work before we met him, we weren't really sure we wanted to meet him.
He was so strange. Most people kept him the creeps. They wanted his office way across the room than the other because he was like Dracula. He was always Peter Lorre or something. He was always dressed in black and he had a very soft voice. But there was always these horrible stories. We heard that he had the skeleton from his fiancée.
Being introduced to Giger through Obannon, Ridley Scott knew early on just what to base the look of his film's monster on from Giger's painting. He also concluded what architectural influences would shape the beast's environment, which, unlike the Nostromo, almost looked like a living being itself, while retaining a mechanical flair with its many ribbed cables and metallic components. According to Gordon Carroll, the first second that Ridley saw Giger's work, he knew that the biggest single design problem, maybe the biggest problem in the film, had been solved.
I just thought it was stunning, and I just stuck to my guns saying, no, that's it. We want to be shooting by so-and-so. That's it. Just to get this right is going to be incredibly difficult. This is beautiful, not just threatening.
However, the producers' wallets weren't as liquid as Giger would have liked them to be, which led to concessions and compromises.
I want to have a landscape who is very much organic-like, and I would like to have old motors from motorcycle or things like that, but there was no time and no money for this. A real mixed up, a real biomechanical landscape.
This is predominantly why the alien landscapes are clad in a thick fog, as an example, and Giger has some criticisms of his own regarding how his biomechanical creations turned out.
They had not money to do it like I designed it. You know, the whole thing looks a little bit like Art Nouveau. It was not organic enough, organic-like. It looked like handmade from artists.
In the way, the environments of Alien are just the proverbial potatoes of the production, as the real meat was the alien, its life cycle, and utterly terrifying nature, as most horror films are in a way only as good as their monsters are, and luckily the Xenomorph became a far from stereotypical creature. The focal point for Alien was to ground it in a more believable context. Instead of the monster being a purely fantastical being, there instead was a logic behind it, from the way it looks and moves all the way to its disturbing reproductive cycle, which leads to a point of fascination for Ridley Scott.
The first thing that I'm going to do when I get back is to get some decent food.
Other directors were alienated by the idea of the Chestburster scene. Ridley Scott, though, was drawn to it in contrast, already picturing how the scene would look like in his head. But in order to get to that point, the team needed to work towards realizing what the different life stages of the alien would look like, which is where Giger's work left another significant imprint, which would be the sexual elements of his art, which, of course, the studio Fox wasn't a big fan of, but with enough resistance from Ridley Scott, they eventually let him and Giger be. One of the more disturbing aspects of the alien as an animal would be the facehugger, or how Ridley Scott called it, the preambulatory penis. The facehugger would attach itself to the victim's face and plant a seed in them, which would eventually, of course, hatch into a parasite that lives in the human and eventually bursts out of the host's body. A form of reproduction so uncomfortable even Giger sounds queasy describing it.
Something with human hands is always scary, very scary. So I had the long fingers. What is the most important part on the facehugger?
Speaking of hands, those were fully articulable, and in initial designs were positioned on the front of the creature instead of its side. Getting the creature's life stages just right was a considerable challenge, as the Xenomorph needed to look animalistic and believable, for which animal parts were used yet again. For the facehugger specifically, it was various parts from sea life, such as oysters and fish scales, while the eggs made use of tripe, which essentially is a cow's stomach.
Which the eggs were designed and obviously made, and they would be the way up they were, with the aperture at the top, with a hydraulic opening, which would open looking very threatening, with Jimmy Shields' great sounds on it. It's still one of the great sounds when it opens, and you hear that viscera, and the strength, you know it's strong.
To really make the eggs come alive, Ridley Scott had to get his own hands dirty as well.
To have sticks in poking looked terrible. So we worked out a method of, as it was about to open, it kind of went like that, lit a little bit. And then I think he looks at it again, and inside are my hands with 2 rubber gloves on, washing up gloves. And all I'm doing is going
Then there was Bolaji Badejo, the actor who brought the Alien film to life. This incredibly tall man couldn't even stand up fully in the Nostromo, and of course, having to wear the suit didn't make that job much easier. Badejo was the man that portrayed the alien. However, he wasn't a creature actor nor a regular actor, rather a graphic designer who was essentially picked off the street. The Nigerian impromptu actor was scouted in London, where he was a waiter at the time, and he was promptly offered a role for his height and notably long legs. Sadly, his role as the alien would be the only acting role in his life, as he passed away at a relatively young age from sickle cell disease. But he was 6'6" tall, and when wearing the alien costume, his height would reach 7 feet, which meant that he essentially had to duck through the set at all times. The suit itself also brought challenges of its own, the main one being that it was composed of various parts, with a skin-tight bodysuit underneath to hide some of the imperfections.
They got him put in that suit, and he was curled up in the change. The amazing thing was, when they shot up, you couldn't even tell that he was up there. The way he uncoiled and came down and then put his arms out, and I mean, it looked like, that crucifix. Christ is ascending. I'm going to take your life now. I mean, it was like very bizarre and very sort of gothic, which goes a lot with what the whole Giger gothic thing is.
While the suit looks great and is kept in good shape today, it was torturous to act in it, as Badejo had difficulties sitting down during breaks and would be drenched in sweat only after a bit of exertion.
Poor guy couldn't sit down, so they made a special swing for him. Tom Skerritt said, I mean, this guy can't walk around like this. This is ridiculous. Do something for this poor person. They hadn't even thought of how he was going to sit down because you have that tail and that rubber suit. I mean, that poor thing was in that suit all day long.
Before Badejo could waltz around in that suit of his, the alien needed to be born first though, which led to an uncomfortable experience for the actors and crew aboard the Nostromo. You see, while the Chestburster obviously is a prop, in preparation for the scene, a visit to the butcher was made and many insides of animals were brought: lungs, guts, kidneys, and the works. Anything that they could get their hands on.
The Chestburster, that was a very heavy scene. I think the strongest thing in the whole film.
We went and got all sorts of horrible things and buried it inside the chest. The special effects guys had arranged a ram for it to break.
To make an uncomfortable situation even worse, the smell on set was worsened with chemical treatments and the lights needed to illuminate the set. In order to safely use the organs on set, they were treated with formaldehyde. And more importantly for this situation, it smells like you know what. Then there were the lights. The Chestburster scene took place in a brightly lit set with a light pointed directly at the animal guts, essentially toasting it as time went on, which arguably might have been a good thing for the scene, as the actors on set didn't know what exactly was coming for them.
And the special effects guy says to me, oh, you'll get a little blood on you. I said, oh, okay. And that thing burst out of there, and they shot me with an entire blood pellet. It was like a jet of blood that hit I was so taken aback. My knees hit the back of the banquette, and I flipped upside down.
Oh, God!
The smelly nature of the film also extended to Giger's work on the environments. While he expected to work with dry bones for his biomechanical creations, they instead were freshly purchased from the slaughterhouse.
I thought bones, they are dried and old, but they brought this fresh from the slaughterhouse, and there was a smell horrible, because the inside of the bones that was just fresh, and we had a big box full of bones, and there was such a smell that we even myself, I wouldn't see that as please go away with this.
For the famous space jockey scene, Ridley Scott and the production team had to really fight for the funds to build that set just for the one scene, telling Fox that would alert audiences right from the start that this was not a B-movie. Fox would finally agree, and to save money, only one wall of the set was created, and Giger would go to work airbrushing the entire set and the space jockey by hand. Now, when it comes to shooting special effects for the film, which would include models that were intricately designed and painted, there was a little bit of friction between the team and Ridley Scott.
He already wanted to look through the camera and line those shots up himself, so I think he kind of, consciously or unconsciously, he kind of said, no, that's not quite right, that's a little bit too... I think in fairness, I think the shots were a little bit too colourful sometimes. And Ridley I know you could grade them down, but Rid sort of had these specific ideas, really.
No matter what the big plan was that everyone seemingly agreed to, Ridley wanted to have a hand in everything. And nothing really went the way it was supposed to go initially. There were also quite a few changes. For instance, the Nostromo was originally supposed to be painted a more vibrant yellow.
It originally started out as this basic space tug. We shot on this thing with it actually painted yellow for 6 months, and this was the time when Brian Johnson was involved in the film. However, Brian went off to work on Empire Strikes Back, and we painted the spacecraft grey on Ridley Scott's orders.
A major problem with the models for the Nostromo and other practical props was the lighting. Lighting these models was difficult because more money needed to be spent on lights for scenes than was at first expected, and getting the right angles and the right fill lights correctly was a bit of a challenge as well.
You get the shape right, and then you got to walk around it with the lights, and this cameraman on that was Denny Ailing on all the effects. And we'd walk around, and I'd literally have him just on with the lights, pulling the lights around, and then just stand there and say, stop. And then he'd come in and look at him, and he'd say, okay, it's too much here, it's too much, we've got to fill. So I always hated filling because I wanted to be really harsh. But Denny would always force me into filling.
When it comes to the interior of the Nostromo itself, the bridge's computer terminals were actually CGI-created imagery. Ridley Scott would use a computer to create all of the images on the bridge's computer terminals. Some of these graphics on the screen also represent what is known as the Semiotic, standard for all commercial transstellar utility lifter and heavy element transport spacecraft, created by Ron Cobb.
I talked him into all these industrial symbols around and color coding of everything. I thought that would be kind of cynical and create that industrial revolution feel, of people getting lost in machines.
Obannon had brought Ron Cobb and artist Chris Foss, with whom he'd worked on Dark Star and Dune respectively, to work on designs for the human aspects of the film, such as the spaceship and spacesuits. Ron Cobb helped design a lot of the elements of the interior of the Nostromos, saying, "My method for designing the Nostromo interior was to emulate the engineering of the entire landing shuttle as though it were real, from the interior to the exterior and back again. So while I was not supposed to be spending any time deriving exterior designs from my all-encompassing technique, I did produce them, if only as a personal guide to making the interior sets more interesting."
Ron does drawings and isometric visuals, which you can virtually put a slide ruler on it and cost it, right? And everything works with Ron. He can tell you how the airlock's going to open and why it's there and why the door's got to be this way and that way. So he talks up a very interesting technical, storm. So it was always fascinating to listen to him speculate.
Many of the crew praised his ability to design such a realistic and believable interior of the ship. And interesting the interior was, as the team would choose to also utilize CRT TVs instead of using flat screens to give the feel of a legacy technology to give the ship the appearance of having been patched together by cheap old tech. And while that may make it seem fairly archaic today, it does add a lot of that gritty vibe that this film is going for. But if you're wondering if they actually could have made the screen a bit more sleek and flat back in 1978, you might be surprised to remember that 11 years prior, in 2001 A Space Odyssey, they actually used flat screens on the spaceship, giving it a sleek, futuristic look even by today's standards. They did this by hand animating the imagery and projecting it onto flat surfaces. But I think this goes without saying, replacing the retro and cyberpunk vibes of Alien with more sleek tech would kind of take away from what makes the film so great. Now, when it came to the inside of the Space Jockey spaceship, Ridley Scott thought that it just didn't look large enough. And to fix this problem without having to ask for more production funding, Scott would employ the help of his two sons and the cinematographer's Derek Van Lint's son. They would don smaller spacesuits, but during production would actually come close to collapsing due to the lack of oxygen and how hot it was within the suit. They would eventually add oxygen systems to help the actors later on in production. One of the craziest facts about the production of the first Alien film is that the motion control units were not used at all. As we know by this point, a limitation for Alien meant that the bank account wasn't as liquid as the crew would have liked it to be.
What was cutting edge, which was actually we did not use, was motion control. And we didn't use it simply because the budget didn't allow us all that time to do stop motion photography. So we developed a camera which moved very slowly on a drive mechanism, but we didn't actually repeat moves as such.
The camera would shoot in low frame rates or with slow camera movements, or both. This is how the creeping shots of the Nostromo were achieved.
The actual script made it possible for us to do just regular model work with a high degree of professionalism and extremely wide-angle lenses.
And it enabled them to use other tech, such as fog machines, which only helped to reproduce these convincing results. No motion control at times was actually a blessing in disguise. The other danger on the Nostromo wasn't of a beastly nature, but rather took the form of a corporate tool.
Ash was the real masterstroke, I think, in that he was completely, that was a one-off, wasn't it? That's the first time, you have corporate paranoia.
Ash is an interesting character in Alien, one who during a first watch through may seem fairly docile and reserved at first, but who is also seen as much more sinister of a character after finishing the movie. What makes Ash such an interesting antagonist right next to the Xenomorph is his unassuming nature and the fact that him being an android isn't revealed until a violent altercation between him and the crew breaks out after he tries to dispose of Ripley. With a well-placed hit to the temple, Ash's head comes clean off. Ash is revealed to be an android plant designed to monitor the crew service for Weyland-Yutani, and the revelation makes the viewer understand why Ash acted the way he did up until this point. With some pasta, glass marbles, caviar, and milk, the detached android's head lying in its milky pool of synthetic blood came alive once again, with Ash delivering his farewell and then shutting off. This scene was plagued with some issues. For one, Ian Holmes hated milk and was forced to gurgle some up every take and was covered with it for extended periods of time. The other more annoying problem was that an animatronic head of the actor couldn't be used for that scene. The head cast was made out of latex and it shrunk after it was made, making the cast miss the likeness of the actor and, while creepy, was a little too off to be used for the one-on-one scene in the end.
I thought the head was very beautifully articulated, but I think something went wrong in the drying process. I think, they've changed the level and quality of latexes today, but in those days it shrunk. And he said it shrunk. I said, because you took a head cast, how could it not look like Ian? He said it shrank. I said, oh, God. So we had to get on with it.
Well, everyone knows the film ended with the Nostromo exploding and Ridley getting away in the shuttle after defeating the alien. Ridley Scott actually fought hard for a different ending that might have ended the franchise right there and then. He conceived of a fourth act to the film where Ripley would have to face off with the alien in the shuttle. And while this did in fact become part of the film after Ridley Scott negotiated with Fox for more money, he originally wanted the alien to bite the head off of Ripley and then the alien make the final log entry with Ripley's voice. But this of course was struck down by the producers, who really wanted the alien to die at the end of the film. All the work that has been put into the movie so far, the creature effects, the intricately built sets, the art of Ridley Scott and H.R. Giger, all of these things were compounding into a visually stunning experience, and the editor agreed. This made his role very difficult to fill. Just what do you leave in? What do you leave out? And how will certain scenes actually play out in the final cut?
When you look at the first cut of a film like Alien, you've really got to use your imagination, because there's no sound, for one thing. Lots of those scenes were shot with all these noisy machines or effects working on the stages. So you used to run all these things silent. So you've got to imagine what it's going to be like with all these jingling chains and the rain. So it's like all those things, creeping around corridors with nothing happening. But when you got the music effects and everything. So that was one of the things you had to sort of combat.
And it made the editor's job rather difficult, as he was working with missing context and had to continually ask himself if he was making the right decisions for the cut.
You sit there and look at him creeping around in the rain room silent, and it's boring.
What was made especially difficult for editing the film was pacing and runtime. The final cut was about 2 hours long, which was perfect. However, certain segments which narratively might have been important were ditched. The main scene that was canned was the discussion between a now empowered Ripley, who was armed with a flamethrower, and a victimized Dallas, who was entrapped inside of an alien egg. The interaction was ended with Ripley deciding to cut Dallas's suffering short by torching him, destroying the egg in the process. Ripley discovering Dallas was situated within a sequence which Ripley was escaping the Nostromo, a stressful 17 minutes without dialogue, alleviated by this one conversation, meaning just in the flow of the film, the scene just had to go. Sometimes, though, the lingering scenes were a benefit to the film, as the composer recounted. One extremely long scene he experienced in his initial watch of the film greatly affected the composition he was about to produce. The segment in which a crew member was in search of his cat. The scene was drawn out and a single dangling chain only added to the suspense. Evidently, that sequence wasn't in need of any shortening. When this film was released, the reception to it was initially mixed, but it would go on to make $187 million at the box office, launching both Sigourney Weaver and Ridley Scott's careers. But Fox claimed at the same time the movie had actually lost money, and the dispute over this with Brandywine would actually end up being the linchpin to the creation of the next film, Aliens. And you can check out that crazy story of that crazy production right here.